My name is Claire Renee Whitfield. I am 31 years old. I grew up in Naperville, Illinois, which is the kind of town that looks perfect from the highway, wide streets, good schools. A downtown with a river walk and string lights, and a farmer's market every Saturday from May through October. People move to Naperville on purpose. They save for it. They drive through the neighborhoods on Sunday afternoons and say, someday. My mother, Judith Ann Whitfield, was one of those people. She and my father, Robert, moved there from a 2-bedroom apartment in Elgin when I was 3 years old, and she never once let me forget the sacrifice that move represented. My father was a quiet man who built custom cabinetry and coached my brother's little league team every spring until his knees gave out. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in November when I was 22, halfway through my senior year at the University of Illinois. I came home for the funeral and stayed 2 extra weeks because my mother asked me to, and when I finally drove back to Champaign to finish my semester, she cried at the door in a way that felt less like grief and more like accusation. I tell you this because you need to understand where I come from before you understand what happened to me. I work in brand communications. My official title, the one on my email signature and my LinkedIn profile, is Senior Content Strategist at a mid-sized marketing firm in the West Loop called Parsons Bellamy Group. I write copy that makes people feel things, product launches, nonprofit campaigns. The annual reports that corporations hand out at shareholder meetings to make everyone feel like the company has a soul. I'm good at it. I've won 2 regional Addy Awards, which are not the Oscars, but they're not nothing, and I have a corner desk near a window that looks out over Randolph Street. And I make enough money to live alone in a 1-bedroom in Lincoln Park with a galley kitchen and original hardwood floors that creak in a way I've grown to love. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I was not a woman without a life. I had built something, it was mine. I met Daniel Voss at a friend's birthday dinner in March, 2 years before everything fell apart. It was at a restaurant in River North, one of those places where the lighting is warm amber and the menu is printed on heavy cardstock, and the cocktails have names like the Cartographer and Fog of War. My friend Tamara had reserved a long table in the back, and there were maybe 14 of us, and Daniel was seated directly across from me between a man I didn't know and Tamara's boyfriend. He was 35 with dark blonde hair that he wore slightly long, just past his ears. And he had the kind of jaw that made you think he'd played lacrosse in college and had been told his whole life that he was handsome without becoming entirely ruined by it. He was a financial consultant, independent, he explained, which he clarified meant he worked with small business owners and family offices on wealth management and succession planning. He wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt with no tie, and he smelled, when he leaned across the table to pour me a glass of the Bordeaux he'd ordered, like cedar and something warmer underneath it. Like a fireplace in a room you just walked into, we talked for 3 hours. I mean, we talked, not the careful resume exchange of 2 people on a first date, but the kind of conversation that keeps splitting open into new rooms. He had opinions about Chicago architecture, real ones, not the magnificent mile tour guide variety. He'd grown up in Madison, Wisconsin, and still got visibly emotional when he talked about his grandfather's farm in Dane County. He asked me questions and then actually listened to the answers. He looked at me like I was saying something worth hearing. When the dinner ended, he asked if I wanted to walk, and we walked 6 blocks along the Chicago River in the cold, both of us underdressed and not mentioning it. And he stopped at the Michigan Avenue Bridge and said, "I'd really like to see you again, Claire," and I said, "I think I'd really like that too." We dated for 8 months before I introduced him to my mother. I want you to sit with that number, 8 months. That was not an accident, that was deliberate. I knew my mother, and I knew what she did to the things I loved. When I was 16, I had a best friend named Stephanie Acaffer, who was funny and loud and wore her braids in 2 buns on top of her head, and could make anyone in any room laugh within 4 minutes of meeting them. My mother found a reason not to like Stephanie almost immediately. She was too loud, she used slang, she wasn't focused the way my mother thought I needed friends who were focused. She made small comments over months, quiet and consistent, like water wearing down stone. By the time I was a junior, Stephanie and I had drifted so far apart that we barely spoke. I only understood what had happened years later when I was in therapy for the first time, and my therapist named it clearly. Your mother ran an influence campaign against your friendship, and you were too close to it to see it happening. So I waited. I let Daniel become real and rooted in my life before I let my mother near him. I let him meet my friends, my colleague Priya, who became my work best friend, my brother Kevin and his wife Dana in their house in Schaumburg with their two boys, Aiden and Cooper. I let him become the person who knew I put too much cream cheese on my bagels and that I cried at insurance commercials, and that I kept a list in my phone's notes app of every word I looked up in the dictionary because I was afraid of forgetting them. I let him in fully before I introduced a variable I couldn't control. Judith Whitfield met Daniel Voss on a Saturday in November, the weekend before Thanksgiving. I brought him to my mother's house, the same Naperville house. The one with the brick front and the mature oak in the yard that had grown so wide its roots were slowly lifting the driveway, for lunch. My mother made pot roast and mashed potatoes and a green bean casserole with the crispy onions on top, and she set the formal dining room table with the good china. The set with the blue bands around the edges that only came out for Easter and Christmas, and apparently this. I was nervous in a way I hadn't been in years. I watched my mother from across the table, looking for the tells, the slight tightening around her eyes when she disapproved of something. The way she laughed a half-second too late when she was being polite but not genuine. I watched her the way you watch a dog that's bitten before, carefully, without turning your back. But here is the thing I need you to understand, the thing that I have rolled around in my mind every single day since I learned the truth. My mother loved Daniel. Or she performed love in a way that was indistinguishable from the real thing. She laughed at his stories. She asked follow-up questions. She touched his arm when he said something that moved her. She told him, over apple pie, that I had always had excellent taste and that she could see he was someone who understood what it meant to take care of a person. She looked at me across the table with what I can only describe as pride. I drove home that night with Daniel's hand in mine on the center console, and I cried a little quietly, looking out the passenger window. And when he asked what was wrong, I said nothing. I'm just happy. And I had been so certain she would find a reason to dismantle this, and instead she had wrapped her arms around it and called it wonderful. I should have known then. The woman I knew did not do that. Daniel proposed 11 months later on the 4th of July on the rooftop of his apartment building in the South Loop. He had hung string lights and set up a folding table with a bottle of Veuve Clicquot in ice and 2 glasses. And when the fireworks started over the lake, he got down on one knee with a ring that had a round center stone and 2 small sapphires flanking it. Not because someone told him I liked sapphires, but because he'd remembered me mentioning once, 7 months earlier, that my grandmother had a sapphire ring she wore every day of her adult life. And that it was the piece of jewelry I associated most strongly with the idea of permanence. I said yes before he finished the question. My mother cried on the phone when I called her. Actual tears, I could hear them. She said, "Oh, Claire, oh, sweetheart. He's exactly right for you. I knew it from the moment I met him." We set a date for the following October, 14 months away, which seemed like enough time to plan the wedding I wanted without losing my mind entirely. A Saturday. A venue in the West Loop that had exposed brick and cathedral ceilings and a back courtyard with a fountain. 200 guests. A band, not a DJ, because Daniel said he'd always imagined dancing to live music at his wedding, and I had found that detail so specific and real that it made me love him more. My mother, it turned out, had opinions about all of it. The venue was too industrial. The guest list should be larger. What about the Haverford family from church? What about the DeLuchas who had known me since I was in diapers? The band was unnecessary when a good DJ cost half the price. The dress I was considering, an A-line with a low back and short train, was not what she had envisioned. I managed these comments the way I had learned to manage my mother. I absorbed them without agreeing, redirected when I could. and made my decisions quietly and without announcing them until they were final. It was exhausting, the way her presence was always exhausting, but I had a life's practice in it and I believed I could hold the boundary. What I didn't see, what I couldn't see because I was looking at her and not at him, was that Daniel had started changing. It happened slowly. That is the only way these things happen. The first thing I noticed was the phone calls. Daniel had always been a present person, not in a performative way, not in the way of someone who made a show of putting their phone face down at dinner, but genuinely attentive in a way that was easy and uncontrived. He listened when you spoke, he remembered things when we were together, we were together. But starting around February, 4 months after the engagement, I began to notice that he was stepping out to take calls, not frequently at first. Once at dinner at a restaurant in Andersonville, once at his apartment on a Sunday morning. He'd excuse himself, go into the hallway or the other room, and come back a few minutes later with his expression carefully neutral in a way that it hadn't been before. When I asked who he'd been talking to, he would say a client, and I believed it, because he was a financial consultant and clients called at odd hours, and I was not a suspicious person. In March, he began picking fights about the wedding. Not loud fights, Daniel wasn't a loud fighter. But an argument started forming around the venue, a sustained, quiet pressure that I didn't immediately recognize as a campaign because it didn't look like one. He mentioned, casually, that his aunt in Milwaukee was having trouble with flights and wouldn't it be easier for out-of-towners if the venue were somewhere with better proximity to a hotel block. He asked once if I was certain about the A-line silhouette, not because he didn't like it, but because he'd seen me admire a different style at someone's wedding on Instagram. Maybe I should look at more options. He agreed with my mother twice in one evening at Sunday dinner about the guest list. I chalked it up to wedding stress. To the peculiar collaborative pressure of planning an event that had to satisfy two families, 400 preferences, and an industry designed to make you feel that nothing you choose is quite right. I told myself he was adjusting, that the reality of the commitment was landing differently now that the date was real. But in April, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I had been working late on a campaign pitch and I came home to Daniel's apartment. I still had my own place, but we spent most nights together, and I found him at the kitchen island with his laptop open and his phone face down beside it. And when I came in, he startled in a way that I had never seen him startle. It was small, it was 1/2 second. He flipped the laptop screen down and picked up his phone and turned toward me smiling, asking how the pitch had gone, and everything that followed was completely normal, warm us. We made dinner together, we watched a movie, we went to bed, I lay awake for a long time. The next morning I told myself I had invented it. The startle, the screen, the phone face down. I told myself I was pattern matching because I was anxious about the wedding, about my mother, about the particular difficulty of building a life with another person and praying it holds. I told myself I was afraid of being happy and looking for evidence of disaster. I almost convinced myself, but in May I found the first piece of evidence that I hadn't invented anything at all. I was at Daniel's apartment alone on a Thursday evening while he was at a client dinner downtown. I was making pasta on the stove and I knocked a bottle of olive oil off the counter, and it rolled behind the island and bumped up against the baseboard, and when I crouched down to retrieve it I saw, half tucked under the baseboard as though it had slipped there by accident, a folded piece of paper. I picked it up, I don't know what I expected, a grocery list, a takeout menu, something mundane. I unfolded it and it was a handwritten list of 9 items. The handwriting was not Daniel's, which was a cramped, all capitals architectural print. This handwriting was loopy and slanted and it took me a moment to place it, but I placed it. My mother's handwriting. The list read, 1 venue, push for Grand Hyatt Ballroom, family connection / pricing, 2 guest list, Haverford, DeLucci, Pastor and Mrs. Crane 3. Dress, not the low back, photos last forever, 4 band, use Kevin's DJ contact instead, 5. Honeymoon, she mentioned Tuscany but the Sandals Resort is more appropriate, 6. Timeline on the house, before or after, 7. Joint account, how is she responding? 8. keep her close to me, farther from the Priya situation. 9. The contract terms reviewed and signed. I read the list 3 times. Then I folded it and put it in the pocket of my jeans and stood up from the floor and turned off the burner under the pasta and sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the island and stayed there for a very long time. Contract terms reviewed and signed. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I sat on Daniel's kitchen floor while the pasta cooled in the pot, and I breathed through my nose the way my therapist had taught me to do when something was too large to hold all at once. And I thought, I have to be very, very careful now. He came home from the client dinner at 9:30, carrying a to-go bag with leftover risotto from the restaurant, and I was on the couch with my laptop open and a glass of wine on the coffee table. And I looked up at him the way I always looked up at him, and I smiled. "How was it?" I asked. "Good," he said. "Tedious. The client talks too much about his boat." He set the bag in the fridge and came and sat beside me and kissed my temple and asked about the pasta. "I lost my appetite," I said. "Ate some crackers instead." He nodded. He picked up his book from the side table. We sat together in the lamplight in the comfortable silence of two people who lived inside the same orbit, and I kept my face perfectly still. And underneath my stillness, I was doing the thing I had learned to do growing up in a house where things were rarely what they appeared to be. I was documenting. Not writing anything down yet, just noting the phone calls, the startle, the shifted opinions, my mother's handwriting, the contract terms reviewed and signed. I was building an inventory in my mind, precise and quiet, and I was deciding what to do with it. The next morning, I bought a composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and I took it to my office and kept it in my desk drawer under a folder of old campaign briefs. Every evening, I wrote down what I had noticed that day, conversations, behaviors, the things Daniel said that seemed to echo my mother's opinions in language that was slightly off from his own. The moments I caught him checking his phone with a particular focused tension that wasn't there when he texted his friends or handled ordinary client messages. I didn't know yet what the contract was. I didn't know yet the full shape of what my mother had built. But I had worked in communications long enough to recognize the architecture of a campaign, and what was being run against my life had all the hallmarks of one: consistent messaging, coordinated pressure, a clear desired outcome. The outcome, as best I could read it, was a version of my wedding, my home, my finances. In my social circle, that looked like what my mother had always wanted my life to look like rather than what I had chosen. And Daniel, the man who smelled like cedar and fireplace warmth. The man who had remembered my grandmother's ring and gotten down on one knee under Chicago fireworks. Daniel was either the instrument of this plan or its architect. And I didn't yet know which. I needed to find out. I needed to be very, very careful, and I needed to not let either of them know that I was looking. June arrived with its particular Chicago excess. Heat that came on suddenly, the whole city exhaling, rooftop bars filling by 4 in the afternoon, the lake brilliant and impassable. The bridal shower my mother had insisted on planning was scheduled for the second Saturday of the month, at a venue she had chosen, a private room at a restaurant in Naperville. With a menu she had selected and a guest list she had curated without, as I later discovered, giving me the full list in advance. The shower was lovely in a surface way, flowers everywhere, good wine, small cucumber sandwiches and fruit platters. My mother in a pale blue dress with her hair done, receiving everyone warmly, introducing herself to my friends as though she had known them for years. My friend Tamara, who had seated Daniel across from me at that first dinner, found me in the bathroom during a quiet moment and said, "Your mom is a lot," and I laughed and said, "Yeah." And that was the whole conversation, because what else was there to say? What I noticed at the shower was the Priya situation my mother had put on that list. Item 8, keep her close to me, farther from the Priya situation. Priya Nair had been my closest friend at work for 4 years. We had started at Parsons Bellamy within 6 months of each other, and we'd bonded over the peculiarity of being two women of color in a mostly white, mostly male creative department. Priya's parents had immigrated from Kerala when she was 2, and she had the specific Particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a lifetime making herself legible to rooms that weren't built for her. We ate lunch together 3 days a week. We texted constantly. We had an ongoing competition to find the best biryani in Chicago that had been running for 3 years without a winner. At the shower, I watched my mother manage Priya with extraordinary subtlety. She was warm to her face, nothing traceable, but she seated her at the far end of the room and filled the seats around her with women Priya didn't know well. She mentioned, in conversation with my aunt and two family friends, that I had been spending a lot of time with work friends lately, and she hoped I wasn't losing sight of my real support system. She didn't say Priya's name, she didn't have to. I excused myself at one point and went outside into the afternoon heat and stood in the restaurant's small parking lot and breathed. There was a cardinal on the telephone wire above me, red as a warning, and I watched it until it flew away. My mother was executing a plan. The list was not a brainstorm, it was a project document. And Daniel somehow was involved enough to have a physical copy of it in his apartment. I went back inside and ate a cucumber sandwich and opened another present and smiled for photographs, and the whole time I was noting, cataloging, building my case. The thing about escalation is that it doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a Sunday dinner in July where Daniel mentions, for the third time in 2 weeks, that he's been thinking about the joint account, and when we plan to set that up, and you notice that your mother is watching his face when he says it with a small smile that she smooths out before he turns to her. Sometimes it looks like a Wednesday morning when you're brushing your teeth and Daniel says he ran into your mother at the farmer's market, just by chance. And he mentions it so casually that you're supposed to absorb it without thinking about the fact that your mother lives 40 minutes from the Lincoln Square farmer's market and has never, in your memory, gone to one. Sometimes escalation looks like the afternoon in late July when you're at work and Priya comes to your desk with an unusual expression on her face, something between concern and reluctance, and she says, "Can I tell you something and you won't make it weird?" And you say yes, and she says that Daniel ran into her at the coffee place on Wells Street last week and was unexpectedly cool to her, not rude. Just off, and he'd said something odd about how you'd been feeling overwhelmed by all your obligations and needed to simplify your social commitments before the wedding. And Priya says, "I just didn't want to not tell you. I kept my face neutral. I said, thank you for telling me, and I meant it with every cell of my body." That night I added it to the notebook. Daniel was carrying out item 8 on my mother's list. He was not the passive recipient of her plan. He was executing it, reviewed and signed. Whatever that contract was, he had agreed to it. He had agreed to it before he proposed to me on that rooftop under the fireworks while I cried and said yes, and believed that some things are exactly what they appear to be. I went into the bathroom, turned on the shower so the sound covered me, and I sat on the cold tile floor and I let myself feel fully and completely what had been done to me. Then I stood up. I washed my face, I turned off the shower, I went back to the notebook. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to hold up the folded list and say explain this and watch his face tell me everything I needed to know. But I was my mother's daughter in at least this one way. I understood that timing was everything. He had something I needed, the contract, its terms. The evidence of what she had paid him to do and when and why. If I confronted him now, I would get denials, maybe an explanation carefully shaped to sound innocent. I would get what he wanted me to have. I needed to wait, I needed to find the contract, and I needed to do it before October. The crisis arrived on a Thursday evening in August, 17 days before we were supposed to put down our final payment on the wedding venue. I had come home from work later than usual. We'd had a campaign deadline and I'd stayed until almost 8. And when I let myself into Daniel's apartment, I heard him on the phone in the bedroom. Door not quite closed, voice low but not low enough. I stood in the entry hall with my work bag still on my shoulder and I listened. "She doesn't know anything," he said. "I've been careful." A pause. "The timeline is fine. The account conversation is coming. I've laid the groundwork." Another pause longer. "Judith, I understand. I said I'd handle it." My mother's name. I set my bag down so slowly and silently that it was like diffusing something. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and was standing at the counter drinking it when he came out of the bedroom, phone in his pocket, expression neutral. "Hey," he said. "Didn't hear you come in, just got here," I said. "Who was that?" "Client," he said. I looked at him for a moment, just a moment. "Okay," I said. "What do you want for dinner?" That night I did not sleep. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about the word careful. I've been careful. Careful meant he was actively managing my perception. Careful meant there was a version of this situation that was true and a version he was maintaining for my benefit, and the gap between them was wide enough to hide something substantial. The next morning he left early for a client meeting in Evanston and I stayed behind. I worked from home on Fridays, and I sat at his kitchen island with my laptop open and my coffee going cold. Beside it, and I thought about where. In this apartment, a financial consultant would keep a physical contract. He had a desk in the second bedroom. He used it as a home office, a clean space with 2 monitors and a filing cabinet and a printer on a shelf. I had been in it dozens of times. It was organized in the particular way of someone who kept their professional life separate from their domestic life. Client folders labeled in the cabinet, receipts in a labeled tray. The printer always with paper loaded. I went to the desk, I sat in his chair, I opened the filing cabinet. I was not looking for something hidden. A hidden document would have been put somewhere I couldn't easily find. I was looking for something labeled in a way that was meant to be invisible through normality. Misfiled, maybe, or labeled with a client's name I didn't recognize. I went through the cabinet methodically, the way I would research for a campaign, not grabbing or rushing, just reading. Client names I recognized from conversations, tax documents, insurance policies, his lease. And then, near the back of the second drawer in a folder labeled JW Estate Planning Consult, I found it. The contract was 6 pages. It was typed on plain white paper, not letterhead, which I noted immediately as a choice. Someone had not wanted this to be traceable to a firm or an office. It was dated 14 months ago, which was 4 months after I introduced Daniel to my mother. I will not recount every line of it here. I will tell you what it said. My mother had hired Daniel Voss, in his capacity as an independent financial consultant, to perform what the document described as family wealth integration advisory services related to one Claire Renee Whitfield's financial accounts, real property, and estate planning instruments. The scope of services included facilitating joint financial account establishment between Claire Whitfield and Daniel Voss, with right-of signature designated to both parties. Advising on the transfer of property ownership or mortgage co-signatory status, and counseling on estate beneficiary designations to ensure alignment with family wealth planning goals. Daniel's compensation was described as a success fee structure, a lump sum upon marriage, a second payment upon joint account establishment, a third upon any real property transfer or co-signing event. The total value was $112,000. In exchange, Daniel agreed to maintain relationship continuity with Claire Whitfield through the date of legal marriage, to execute all advisory services described herein, and to take no action to disclose or compromise the terms of this agreement. Signed at the bottom, Judith Ann Whitfield, Daniel Thomas Voss, a notary stamp, a date. I sat in his desk chair and I read it twice front to back, $112,000. My mother had paid a man to court me, propose to me, keep me close enough to sign documents and have his name put on my house and my accounts. She had recruited my fiancé before the engagement. She had cried on the phone when I called to tell her I'd said yes, and she was crying because the plan was working, because her investment was performing according to terms. I took photographs of every page on my phone. I put the folder back exactly where it had been, at the same angle with the same papers in front of it. I closed the filing cabinet drawer. I went to the kitchen and stood at the sink and held the edge of the counter and breathed. He had proposed to me 11 months into this. He had been operating under contract for 4 of those months before the proposal. Every conversation I'd believed was real, Every memory I'd stored as evidence that good things were possible and people could be trusted, it had been a performance. The ring with the sapphires. He hadn't remembered my grandmother's ring. Or if he had, he'd used it instrumentally, the way you use a detail in copy to make someone feel known. I washed my hands. I made fresh coffee. I sat down at the kitchen island and opened my phone and called my brother. Kevin answered on the second ring. I could hear Aiden and Cooper in the background, the particular noise of a Saturday morning with small children. "Hey, Claire Bear, what's up? Is Dana home?" I asked. A pause. Something in my voice, I suppose. "Yeah, what's wrong?" "I need to come over," I said. "I need to show you something and I need you to not say anything to anyone until I figure out what I'm doing." He came to pick me up 40 minutes later. On the drive to Schaumburg, he didn't ask questions. That was Kevin. He had my father's particular quality of sitting in silence with someone and making it feel like company rather than absence. I sat at their kitchen table while Dana got the boys settled with a movie upstairs, and then I sat across from my brother and sister-in-law and I told them everything. The list behind the baseboard. The phone call I'd overheard, the contract in the filing cabinet. I showed them the photographs on my phone. Kevin looked at the photos for a long time. I watched his face cycle through something and come out on the other side of it controlled and quiet. "Mom paid him," he said. "It wasn't a question." $112,000, I said. Dana had her hand over her mouth. "What are you going to do?" Kevin asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I need to talk to someone, a lawyer maybe." Kevin nodded. "Dana's cousin is a family attorney in the loop," he said. "Marcus Chen, he's sharp. He's handled some complicated family stuff before." He looked at Dana. "I can call him Monday," she said. "He'll see you." I thanked them. I sat with them through the afternoon, staying for dinner because I couldn't go back to Daniel's apartment yet and look at his face and not let him see what I knew. Dana made roast chicken and the boys came down and Cooper climbed into my lap and showed me a drawing he'd made of a race car. And I held his small, warm weight and looked at the drawing and said, "This is the best race car I've ever seen," and meant both things at once. I met Marcus Chen in his office on a high floor in the loop on Tuesday morning. He had the quiet, organized energy of someone who spent his professional life inside other people's worst situations and had learned to be useful without being flustered by them. He read the photographs I'd taken of the contract without expression. He asked me 3 questions. Was I legally married? No. Was my name currently on any joint accounts with Daniel Voss? No. Was I on record as a co-signer or owner on any real property with him? No. Then right now, Marcus said carefully, he has not executed the financial portions of the contract. He's been paid to put you in a position, but the position hasn't been completed. What does that mean for me? It means you have time. He set the photographs down and folded his hands on the desk. But I want you to understand something. What your mother has done here is potentially actionable: fraud, undue influence, conspiracy to commit financial exploitation, depending on how a court wants to read it. But those are complicated claims that take time to build. Right now, what I want you to focus on is this: do not sign anything. Do not establish any joint accounts. Do not change any beneficiary designations. Do not let anyone, including Daniel, co-sign anything related to your existing financial life. He's been asking about the joint account, I said. Of course he has. Marcus was not unkind about it. Don't do it. And do not, for any reason, let him know you found the contract. I looked at him. Let them play their hand, he said. You're 14 weeks from the wedding. You have evidence that he is operating under a contract with your mother. Let them continue to operate as though you don't know. Let them build toward the moment they believe they've achieved their objective. He paused. And when that moment comes, make sure you're ready and they're not. I drove back to my own apartment in Lincoln Park. I'd quietly started spending more nights there since August, and I sat at my kitchen table with my notebook in front of me and I thought about what letting them play their hand meant and what I needed to do before they played it. What I did not expect was what I discovered next. I had believed the contract was the whole truth. I had been wrong. In September, 3 weeks before the wedding, I received an email. The sender was a woman named Allison Voss, Daniel's ex-wife. I had not known he had been married before. The email was 4 paragraphs. She had found me through my professional website. My Parsons Bellamy profile was public-facing. She had been following my engagement on social media, she wrote, because she and Daniel shared a son 7 years old named Oliver. She wanted to tell me that she was not writing out of bitterness or to interfere. She had moved on, she was remarried, she lived in Indianapolis now. She was writing because she needed to tell me something she felt I deserved to know. Daniel, she wrote, had gone through something similar with her family. Her father had been a wealthy man, not as wealthy as he'd appeared as it turned out. But he'd appeared very wealthy, and Daniel had entered their relationship through a professional connection with her father's estate planner. She had been in love with him before she understood the shape of what she was in. By the time she understood it, there was a child and a mortgage and a legal marriage, and extricating herself had taken 2 years and cost her more than money. She was not sure, she wrote, what the specific arrangement was in my case, but she recognized the pattern and she thought I should know it existed. She included her phone number. I read the email 4 times, then I called her. Allison Voss had a warm, slightly tired voice, the voice of someone who had come out the other side of something hard and was still carrying some of the weight of it. She told me more than she'd been able to fit in the email. She told me that Daniel had a pattern. She didn't know if pattern was the right word. Whether it was a calculated choice or simply the kind of opportunism that takes whatever shape the room presents, of establishing himself in situations of family wealth transfer. He was genuinely good at finance. He was also good at positioning himself inside the trust of families who had money to protect. Did he love you? I asked her. I don't know why I asked it. I needed to know. She was quiet for a moment. I think he was capable of it, she said finally, but I also think he made a choice about what was more important to him. Another pause. I'm sorry this happened to you. He has a son, I said. Oliver is 7. He sees Daniel on alternating holidays and 4 weeks in the summer. Her voice was carefully neutral, the voice of a woman who had learned to talk about this without letting it cost her every time. Oliver is wonderful. Daniel is a decent father, I'll give him that. I thanked her. We stayed on the phone for almost an hour. When we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table in the quiet and thought about a 7-year-old boy named Oliver who didn't know his father had a second life that ran underneath his official one. And I thought about my grandmother's sapphire ring that had symbolized permanence, and I thought about the word careful. I've been careful, he had been very careful. He had left out an ex-wife and a child. He had hidden a contract in a filing cabinet folder labeled JW Estate Planning. He had taken my mother's money and used it to make me feel known. I added Allison's name and information to the notebook. I called Marcus Chen and told him about the call. He was quiet for a moment, then said, that actually helps us. A documented prior pattern is useful context if this becomes litigation. It's not just him, I said. My mother built this. She found him. Yes, Marcus said she did. I thought about the pot roast dinner. My mother in her dining room with the good china and the blue-banded plates, asking Daniel follow-up questions and touching his arm and looking at me with what I had believed was pride. She had already signed the contract by then. She had been evaluating her investment. What do I do now? I asked Marcus. Now, he said, you wait, let them come to you. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel sat across from me at dinner at a restaurant in the West Loop and said he thought we should set up the joint account this week, before things got too hectic with final preparations. He said it with a particular gentleness, a care that I now understood was not care at all but precision, the calibrated softness of someone managing a timeline. Let me think about it, I said. I'm a little overwhelmed with the final payments. He covered my hand with his on the table. I know, that's exactly why I think getting the account set up will make things easier. We can manage everything from one place. I looked at his hand on mine. Let me just get through the venue payment first, I said, then we'll set it up. He smiled. He nodded. He refilled my wine. That night I lay in my apartment and I read back through the notebook from the beginning. The phone calls, the startle, the list behind the baseboard, the contract, Allison's email. And underneath all of it, my mother's handwriting looping and slanted, the contract terms reviewed and signed. I had everything I needed. I called Marcus Chen in the morning and said, I'm ready. The wedding rehearsal was on a Friday evening. The wedding was on Saturday, October 14th. I had made my arrangements carefully and quietly over the preceding 2 weeks, with the precision I had been building toward since I found that piece of paper behind Daniel's kitchen baseboard. Marcus Chen had prepared a document package, the contract photographs, Allison Voss's email, a log of relevant financial conversations Daniel had initiated, and a letter outlining potential legal exposure for Daniel, for my mother, in the event that any of the financial objectives of the contract were pursued. Marcus had also connected me with a financial fraud specialist, a woman named Donna Reyes who worked out of an office in the River North and who had, upon reviewing the contract, told me plainly that what my mother had executed was, in her professional opinion, an attempt to facilitate financial exploitation through a romantic deception, and that the documentation we had was strong. Not airtight, nothing is airtight, but strong. I also called Allison Voss again. I told her what I was planning. I asked if she would be willing to be reachable on the day of the wedding in case I needed a statement or confirmation of what she'd told me. She said, without hesitation, yes. What I did not do was tell Daniel or my mother anything. I continued to be Claire, who was overwhelmed but happy, who kept redirecting the joint account conversation with the honest-sounding reason that she wanted to wait until after the honeymoon to handle financial logistics. I continued to attend the final dress fitting, the rehearsal dinner plans, the conversation with the florist about the centerpieces. I continued to perform the life of a woman who was exactly where Daniel and my mother believed she was. The performance cost me. I will not pretend it didn't. There were nights I stood in my bathroom and looked at my own face in the mirror and felt a grief that was enormous and shapeless, not grief for Daniel specifically, but grief for what I had believed when I said yes under those fireworks, the uncomplicated joy of it, the feeling of being known. That feeling had been real, even if its source was not, and losing it was a particular kind of pain that I hadn't found a clean name for yet. But I had learned something from my mother and from this whole long year of watching and documenting. You don't act until you know what you're acting into. You hold still until the moment the stillness becomes its own kind of movement. The rehearsal dinner was on Friday evening at a restaurant in Naperville that my mother had chosen naturally, and it was attended by roughly 40 people, family, wedding party, out-of-town guests who'd already arrived. My mother was in her element. She moved through the room with the particular authority of a woman who had planned and controlled this event and knew it, greeting and directing and placing people where she wanted them with the grace of someone who'd been doing exactly this for 30 years. Daniel was warm and attentive all evening. He held my hand at the table. He gave a toast that made people laugh and then made a woman in the third row audibly cry. He knew exactly how to be a fiancé at a rehearsal dinner. He had been performing this role for over a year. At one point in the evening, I caught my mother looking at me from across the room with a private expression, not the performance of maternal pride she showed in company, but something quieter, more satisfied. The expression of someone who believes they have won. She had always confused winning with controlling. She had confused love with management. I held her gaze for a moment and then I smiled at her and she smiled back, and neither of us was smiling about the same thing. The morning of the wedding, I woke in my own apartment, where I had spent the previous night at Priya's insistence. You're staying in your own space, it's good luck. Also, I will physically stop you from going to his apartment. And I lay in the particular morning light of October, pale and gold and thin, and I lay very still. I had told Priya everything 3 weeks earlier. I had needed to tell someone who wasn't Marcus, who wasn't Kevin and Dana, who would look at me with the specific look of someone who both loves you and will help you burn it down if that's what you need. Priya had sat across from me in the coffee shop where we'd had 100 lunches, and she had read the contract photographs on my phone and she had said, slowly and carefully, "Your mother hired your fiancé. Yes, like in writing, 6 pages, notarized. She had set the phone down. Okay, she said, what do you need? I told her. She did not hesitate. The thing I had decided. After all the weeks of planning and the conversations with Marcus and the careful maintenance of a performance that was costing me sleep and appetite, and something I couldn't name, was this. I would let the wedding begin. I would let it proceed to the moment where it became public and real, the moment where both Daniel and my mother believed the plan had arrived at its destination. And then I would stop it. Not because I was interested in a dramatic gesture. I am not, I had never been. Drama was my mother's language, not mine. But because the only moment that would allow the full truth to land in front of everyone was the moment they believed they had already won. Marcus had advised me against this exact approach gently. He'd said the legal case didn't require a public confrontation. I told him I understood that. I told him this wasn't only about the legal case. He had looked at me for a long moment and then said, all right, be precise, don't perform, let the evidence do it. I arrived at the venue in the West Loop at 1 o'clock. My bridesmaids were already there, Priya, my cousin Natalie, 2 college friends. Priya helped me into the dress, the A-line with the low back, because I had never changed my mind about the dress no matter how many times Daniel had gently suggested I might. My hair was up. The ring was on my finger. My mother arrived at 1:30 and came to the bridal suite, and she took my hands in both of hers and looked at me with the full version of her performance, her eyes wet, her voice soft. Saying I was beautiful, saying my father would have been so proud, saying this was the beginning of the best part of my life. I held her hands and I let her say all of it. Thank you, Mom, I said. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 o'clock. The room held 204 people, seated in white chairs in neat rows before a wooden altar arch woven with ivory flowers. The band was set up in the corner, exactly as I had wanted them. The late October light came through the tall windows and fell across everything in long gold panels. Daniel was at the altar at 5 minutes to 3. He was in a dark navy suit with a white boutonniere. From a distance, in that light, he looked exactly like everything I had believed him to be. My brother walked me down the aisle. Kevin had known what was coming. I had told him Wednesday night, he and Dana sitting across from me at their kitchen table again, and he had gone very quiet, and then he had said, "You're sure?" And I had said yes, and he had reached across the table and squeezed my hand. When we stepped into the aisle and the room stood and the string quartet began, he leaned close and said, just quietly enough for me, Dad would have been here for this. I knew what he meant. Not the ceremony, what was about to happen in it. The officiant was a family friend, Pastor William Crane, who was, I noted, on my mother's original list. She had wanted him there, perhaps for the optics of an establishment witness. He was a decent man who didn't know what was happening, and I felt a small regret about that. He began, as they do, dearly beloved. The words were so familiar they were almost not words. I stood across from Daniel at the altar and I held my bouquet and I watched his face, and he was, I will give him this, excellent. He was looking at me the way a person in love looks at the person they love. He had that. When Pastor Crane reached the moment, if anyone knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. I took a breath, and I spoke. Actually, I said I'd like a moment. The room went very still. I turned to face the 204 people in their white chairs. My family, his family, our friends, the colleagues, the Haverford family, and the DeLuchis and Pastor and Mrs. Crane. My mother in the front row, right side, in a pale champagne dress she had shown me before to ask if I approved. I looked at her face. She had a very controlled, careful expression. She had no idea yet what was coming, but she felt something shift, the way you feel a change in air pressure before rain. I need to tell everyone something, I said. And I want to do it here, in front of all of you, because what's been done to me was done quietly, and I think the truth deserves to be heard in a room. Daniel had gone still at the altar. Not the stillness of a confused or surprised person, the stillness of someone whose system has just flagged an anomaly. 14 months ago, I said, my mother, Judith Whitfield, hired Daniel Voss under a written, notarized contract to enter into and maintain a romantic relationship with me. To facilitate the transfer of access to my financial accounts and property, and to legally marry me, upon which he would receive a payment of $112,000. The room made a sound that was not quite a sound. A collective intake, a reorganization. I found the contract, I said. I have photographed it. My attorney has reviewed it. And I have spent the past 4 months quietly confirming everything it describes. I looked at Daniel. He was still at the altar. His face had done something complicated. Daniel, I said, you proposed to me with a ring you chose to echo my grandmother's sapphire, and I thought it meant you knew me. I think maybe you did know me. I think that makes this harder, not easier. I looked at my mother. She was not crying. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was managing, the full frontal stillness of a person who is buying time. She had a lifetime of practice in it, and even now, in this moment, she deployed it. But her hands in her lap, I noticed, were not still. They were pressed together hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Mom, I said, you've been trying to manage my life since I was 16. You drove away my friends and you questioned my choices, and when I built something you couldn't control, you tried to buy control of it. I paused. I am not going to let you. I turned to Pastor Crane, who looked, I will say, genuinely uncertain what the liturgical response to this situation was. We won't be needing the rest of the ceremony, I said. What happened next was not tidy. The room did not respond as a unit. There was a long, stunned beat, and then it was as though different parts of the room had different conversations happening simultaneously. Daniel said my name, once, quietly. I turned to look at him and he said, Claire, with a particular emphasis, and I did not know if it was a plea or an explanation or something he didn't have words for, and I said, please don't. And he closed his mouth. My mother stood up. She stood up in the front row in her champagne dress and she said, in a voice that was very controlled, this is not appropriate, Claire. This is not the place. Where is the place? I said, behind my back, in a contract with my fiancé. There was a murmur, a movement, the room reorganizing around what it was learning. I could see my Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, staring at my mother with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Kevin appeared at my side. He hadn't planned to, I think. He just moved, because he was my brother and he was still the boy who'd coached Little League with my father, and he was not going to let me stand alone. My mother turned to him. Kevin, don't, Kevin said just that. She looked at him for a long moment. And then, for the first time I could remember in my adult life, my mother's controlled expression failed her. It wasn't dramatic. It was a small collapse, a softening around the eyes and mouth that made her look suddenly her age. She sat back down. The room emptied slowly. A wedding that ends this way doesn't clear quickly. People move through stages, shock and confusion, and then the quiet gravitational pull toward the people they know best, the murmured conversations. The sorting. I stood near the altar with Priya beside me and Kevin on my other side, and I watched it happen. Daniel came to me before he left. He came to me alone, without his groomsmen, without his phone in his hand, and he stood a few feet away and he said, I did know you, that was real. I looked at him. The contract was also real, I said. Yes, he said. He didn't argue with that. I'm sorry, Claire, I want you to know I'm sorry. I believed him. I believed he was sorry. I believed that somewhere underneath the contract and the performance and the financial calculation, there was a person who had also felt something true. Or something close enough to true that the distinction was painful. I believed all of that, and it changed exactly nothing about what he had done. You have a son, I said, a 7-year-old. He went very still. I talked to Allison, I said, you should know that. He nodded once. He left. The last guest was gone by 5 o'clock. The flowers were still on the tables. The band had not played a single song. Someone had put out the cocktail hour food, and the past appetizers were still on trays, and the champagne was still on ice. All of it perfectly arranged for a celebration that had not occurred. Priya found the catering manager and explained, quietly, that the food should be donated to the shelter on West Jackson that she knew accepted same-day deliveries. The catering manager, who had clearly been in the room for some portion of the ceremony, agreed immediately and without additional questions. My mother called me the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 4 minutes long. I listened to it once. It covered, in order, that I had humiliated the family, that I had acted irrationally without allowing her to explain, that she had only ever wanted what was best for me, that she had been concerned about my judgment for years, and this only proved her concerns were warranted, and that when I was ready to have a real conversation, she was here. She did not apologize, not in the 4 minute message, not in the text she sent the next day, not in the card she mailed 3 weeks later with a return address printed very neatly on the envelope, which Kevin called truly remarkable in its sustained denial. Marcus Chen filed a civil complaint on my behalf in November. The complaint named both my mother and Daniel Voss as defendants in an action alleging fraud, undue influence, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation. The evidentiary basis, the contract, the photographs, Allison Voss's statement, my documentation notebook, was as strong as Marcus had said it was. Daniel's attorney contacted Marcus 4 weeks after the filing to discuss terms. Daniel's cooperation, it turned out, was the kind of cooperation that came quickly once a person understood the totality of their documented exposure. He provided an affidavit confirming that my mother had initiated the contract, that she had found him through a professional reference network and approached him with the arrangement, that he had been compensated in 2 installments over the 14 months preceding the wedding. The third and final installment, payable upon legal marriage, had not been paid. My mother's attorney took longer. My mother herself took the longest. She called me in February and asked if we could meet. I went to Naperville on a Saturday morning, the same house with the same oak tree whose roots were still slowly lifting the driveway. And I sat across from her at the kitchen table where she'd made pot roast the first day I'd brought Daniel home, and she sat with her hands around a mug of coffee, and she looked at me for a long time. I was afraid, she finally said. Of what? That you'd build a life I wasn't in. She looked at the table. That you'd be fine without me. You always were, even when you were small. You were always going to be fine without me, and I could never. She stopped, started again. Your father kept me from doing things like this. When he was alive, he balanced me. After he died, I didn't have anyone to tell me when I was too much. I looked at my mother. I looked at the way she held the coffee mug with both hands, the way she did it because her hands got cold, a habit I had known my whole life. I looked at the lines around her eyes and the way she had aged in the months since October, a compression of time that felt like grief. What you did, I said, wasn't love. I know you believe it was. But it wasn't, she nodded. She was crying quietly, the real kind. You could have just told me you were afraid of losing me, I said. I didn't know how, she said. I know, I said. I know you didn't. We sat in the kitchen for another hour. We didn't resolve anything. You don't resolve something like this in a single sitting, and I was not going to pretend that we did. But we sat together in the house where I grew up, in the kitchen where she had made pot roast and green bean casserole on the good china, and we were both still present for it, and that was something. By spring, I had moved my things entirely into my own apartment, the Lincoln Park one with the creaking hardwood floors. And I had repainted the bedroom a deep green I'd been thinking about for 2 years and kept talking myself out of. It looked exactly right. I put my grandmother's sapphire ring in a small ceramic dish on my dresser, not hidden, not given away, just there where I could see it. Priya and I finally declared a winner in the biryani competition, a small spot in Devon Avenue that we'd somehow missed for 3 years. And we went there on a Friday and ate too much and disagreed loudly about the raita, and it was perfectly ordinary, and I was grateful for every minute of it. Kevin and Dana came for dinner in April. The boys fell asleep on my couch and I split a bottle of wine at the kitchen table while Kevin dozed in the armchair, and Dana said, "Can I say something?" And I said yes, and she said, "I think you're the bravest person I know," and I thought about that. I wasn't sure brave was the right word. I had been afraid the whole time. I had documented and planned and waited because I was afraid of what would happen if I confronted too soon, or not at all, or in the wrong way. Bravery, I thought, was probably something you felt on the other side of fear, not something that replaced it. I just did what I needed to do, I said. That's what brave is, Dana said. The settlement was finalized in late spring. I will not detail its terms entirely because Marcus advised me not to, and because some of it involved my mother's financial assets in a way that felt private even after everything. What I will say is that the outcome was sufficient and that both Daniel and my mother were required, as part of the terms, to undertake specific actions that acknowledged the harm that had been done. My mother began seeing a therapist. Not because the settlement required it, but because Kevin told her gently and firmly that it was a condition of his continued relationship with her, and she chose her son over her pride. I don't know what happens in those sessions. I don't need to know. I still see her, my mother, not often, not easily. But I see her because she is my mother, and because the version of her that is afraid and coping badly is not the only version of her. And because walking away entirely is a door I'm not ready to close even if I'm not walking through it regularly. We are learning something neither of us knows how to name yet. We are being careful with each other in a different way than we were before, not the careful of someone hiding, but the careful of two people who have been through something and are deciding slowly whether there is something on the other side of it worth building. I don't know the answer yet. I am letting it take the time it takes. There is a path along the Chicago River near my office that I walk sometimes in the morning when I get in early, before the city is fully awake. The water is never quite the color you expect it to be. It changes with the weather and the light and the season, and sometimes it is genuinely beautiful, a particular deep blue-green in early autumn. A pewter gray in winter that catches light in a way that's almost silver. I walk that path and I think about the word permanent. The word I had associated with my grandmother's ring, the word I had been trying to build toward when I said yes under the fireworks. I am still trying to build toward it, just with better information about the foundation. One morning in late May, I was walking the path and I passed an older man sitting on a bench with a coffee cup and a newspaper, and a cardinal landed on the railing near him. Exactly the same red as the one I'd watched outside the bridal shower restaurant in Naperville. The man noticed it and smiled, not a performed smile, not a smile for an audience. Just a person alone with a bright red bird on a Tuesday morning finding it sufficient. I stood there until the bird flew away, then I walked to work. There is a particular kind of freedom that comes from having already survived the worst thing you were afraid of. Not the freedom of someone who has escaped suffering, but the freedom of someone who has gone through it and discovered that the other side exists, that they are on it, that the ground holds. I am 32 years old now. I live in my green-walled apartment with the creaking floors. I am not married. I am not yet sure what permanent looks like from here. But I am looking with my own eyes and nothing else's.